Hello. Cool. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm very honored to kick us off today. My name is Nam. I'm working on Hyperlane, and I've been told by my marketing team that you gotta have spicy titles. So the title that we came up with today was like Unifying Ethereum. How hard can it be? Here's the agenda, roughly speaking, the need for unification, what are we currently doing, and why open frameworks work and why they matter. So maybe a brief history. To be honest, I've only been around since like 2018, so like definitely, actually, since we're like, if you're here, like if people want to kind of chime in of what their experience is of kind of that history, would love to hear it. But right, like I think fragmentation has always been kind of like a topic that has been discussed in Ethereum, right? Like I think from the first days of when Ethereum was started, there was kind of like a lot of different token standards just on like the single Ethereum chain, right? Like I think we went through a lot of iterations and eventually ended up on ERC20, but like in the early days, like tokens had all kind of very different interfaces, and that made kind of like transacting on Ethereum more difficult, right? Like then for quite a while, we worked on, right, like, hey, how do we scale Ethereum? And then we kind of talked a lot about like cross-shard communication, right? Like how do we kind of like have like still with shards this kind of composability for developers, but really we ended up focusing kind of on the like rollup centric roadmap, right? We kind of said like, hey, let's scale general block space via rollups, and we kind of like will maybe figure out the interop between those rollups at a later date. The experience that people have today is that obviously like now like rollups can feel fairly like separate, and like I think there's a lot of like debate about like are rollups Ethereum or vice versa. But I think it's undeniable that like as a normal user that interacts on like the Ethereum ecosystem primarily via rollups today, like it can be quite challenging experience of like going across like different L2s. Obviously, a lot of us in the room here have kind of like are doing like what the most we can to really like improve that experience, right? And I think it's definitely gotten better, especially over the last year. But if you, for example, a developer, right, and like you want to build an application that actually like is across L2s, it can become very difficult. Even honestly, from L1 to L2, I don't know how much you like look at kind of the like developer experience of like using, let's say, even just a like L1 to L2 rollup bridges. Like it can be quite difficult. And so I think one thing that always pops up is kind of this idea of like, hey, like why don't we do more? Right? There's like a lot of angry tweets that happened over the last 3 months of like, especially that coincided with a lot of meme coins on Solana, but really like I think the underlying truth was probably correct, which is everybody was just kind of saying like, man, like Ethereum no longer feels like one chain, right? Like I think back in the good old early days, like we were all on L1 and it was kind of nice. And now on L2, it just feels like, it feels worse somehow. And everybody's kind of like, why don't devs do something, right? Like why are people not doing something? And honestly, the really cool thing that I think a lot of people don't really feel like they're seeing is that people are doing something, right? And obviously, like we as projects have been doing a lot of things, but I think the EF is really, really taking this seriously, right? And I think Josh, especially from the EF, I think has been really instrumental in like putting us all in the same room and just like making us talk to each other. And I think that's something that like I think is honestly generally always underappreciated, but something that I definitely wanted to call out is that like I think more so than ever, I think the Ethereum Foundation and as it's kind of like right like leadership role in our ecosystem has kind of like taken kind of like a stance of like, hey, yeah, we should do something here. And I wanted to take this talk to just kind of be able to go through a bit of the some of the efforts that basically have been kind of like started just in the last 3 months, right? Like from this kind of like this kind of like focal point that was started, I would say ultimately by Josh to kind of like get us all in a room together. I'm not going to go too much into chain-specific addresses because honestly, I personally don't know too much about them. But like I think the two kind of efforts that I'm most familiar with are message passing and intents. And so for message passing, I think, I guess in all transparency, like Hyperlane is a message passing protocol, and we've kind of like worked with a lot of people on having an open standard. But in the past 3 years of me working on this, like we've seen like a long history of people trying to standardize message passing, right? Like this is not a new thing. Like I think originally like 5164 was suggested by Pool Together, right? Like more recently, I think 7786 is probably the most, has kind of like the most steam behind its kind of like standardization. And I think what's really cool is now we have like actually like a regular group, right, spearheaded by Ellie, that is kind of like trying to really figure out like, hey, can this be the time where we are standardizing messaging so that we finally have like simple developer interfaces for developers to build applications, but not have to like be stuck with a vendor for doing so. I'm just going to use this diagram because we have it in our docs, and I didn't have that much time to put more neutral slides, but right, like the way message passing works is that you have a sending contract on the origin chain, and you want to send a message over to the destination chain. Like more typically, that's for like, let's say, lock and mint token bridging. That's right, like you put the tokens on the sending contract, you send a message over to the destination chain, and that like mints you the token, or that like unlocks you the collateral on the destination chain. And like fundamentally, all of these standards look basically the same, right? Like it's like literally the same thing, slightly different function names, slightly different parameters. So why is it so hard, right? Like the goal that we have is that what we really want is we want like vendor and verification independence, right? Like we are in this big ecosystem, and we have like all these different ways of like ultimately securing a message, or right, like having the message be transported. But what's really hard, I think, that what's been hard about standardizing this is that like, can you actually make a non-leaky abstraction, right? Like if you make an interface and then you build like libraries on top, like if you don't make it a tight abstraction, then like all the consumers on top will need to actually consider things that like the underlying message standard didn't kind of put in. And I think the number one thing that I feel like people are like sometimes like glossing over, and that one of the experiences that we have as having built a message protocol is that relaying is like a super important property. Like I think a user, right, like as I saw on the slide here, on a destination chain, somebody has to spend gas to actually process the message on the destination chain. And like as a user, nobody wants to ever do that, right? As a developer, you'd never want to think about that, right? Like really the goal is that like on the origin chain, you can pay somebody for this task, right? Like an origin chain token, so that as a user, right, like you as a developer, you don't want to think about it. You want to forward that cost over to the user because they're the ones initiating the state transition. Relaying, I think, and therefore also quoting for the relaying, to me at least, is like a super important property that like generally I think is kind of a bit glossed over in most message standard, in most people's opinions on message standards. And so therefore, and we've honestly spent way too much time on this. It's like basically like the main thing that we're working on. And so I would hope that like in our efforts for message standardization, we're kind of like not trying to reinvent the wheel and going through exactly the same painful process that we had to go through over the last 3 years. Moving on to the other effort that I think has received a lot of attention in our ecosystem are intents, right? Like I think intents, like honestly, it's probably pretty hard to like be in our industry and not have heard about intents, but just to give you a quick overview of it, this is taken from the Uniswap website, where right, like Uniswap and Across have worked on kind of like 6.7.6.3. But the idea is that like, hey, let's kind of like circumvent all of the hard parts about bridging, and let's just make this like role called the filler do the hard work. And so basically on the origin chain, the user deposits funds into the settlement contract, and then as the filler notes that and observes that, they can actually just give the funds on the destination directly to the user. But then the question becomes, right, like how does the filler get back the tokens on the origin chain? And that's what I typically call settlement. 7683 was meant to basically standardize this. Like similar to messaging, there's a lot of people who basically build fairly similar protocols, right? Like Across looks very similar to like DLN from a conceptual perspective, but it actually becomes very hard to actually like easily use these different protocols through the interfaces, right? And so Uniswap and Hard, Uniswap and Across have, right, like kind of like proposed this ERC 7683. And I always call it like the gold standard of like interop standards, because I don't think there's anything even close to of a successful like interop standard, right? Like there's nothing that has ever had this much like support. And it's not perfect. Like there's definitely like a lot of like kind of technical details that are being discussed, and like I'm sure we will see kind of extensions of the ERC. But I think I just want to note that like it's for sure like the best kind of we have when it comes to standardizing intents. And you might have heard of this thing that called Open Intents Framework. It's something that like was supported and announced by a quite large number of people last week. And so you ask yourself, like, why does it exist? And it existed because we as Hyperlane, we operate a lot on like long tail chains, right? Like basically think of this like as like, oh, Conduit, Caldera, right? Like it makes it super easy to launch a new chain. Let's say, right, like Ellie goes to Caldera and says like, I want to launch Ellie chain. And then the first thing that usually happens when we have done that is like, hey, here's interrupt message passing. But really what they want is they want this intent experience, right? Like they don't want just like, oh, from Ethereum to their chain. They want to allow their users to go from like Base or Arbitrum or Optimism to Ellie chain. And we never had an answer for it. And it got to the point where like people built their own intent protocols. And me as an engineer, that just felt like very inefficient because everybody just like reinvented, right? Like, oh, the like smart contracts, the relayers. And so we started working on this, and I think we kind of like noted that a lot of people found that interesting. And so, here's a graph of like, intent-based bridging over time. I think that came from Hard, if I remember correctly. But yeah, so basically the idea was like, hey, why don't we have an open framework that has kind of some of these like shared building blocks that people can use, that they don't have to start from scratch, right? Like the thing I always say is that like for a team to get an intent experience on their own chain from scratch, it probably takes a team of like 2 engineers for like 3-4 months to get you there. And the goal is like, hey, like 80% of this is like super reusable. So let's put this in a framework, right? Like an open source solver, a rebalancing bot, like modular smart contracts so that like you can use, right? Like sure, you can use Hyperlane for settlement, but you could also use Polymer. You could use your own thing, right? Like the idea is that like it's just open source contracts that open source code that you can use to bring the time down from like 2 engineers, 3-4 months to hopefully 1 engineer in 2 weeks. I'm like sometimes people call me like a one-trick pony because all I know is what like open frameworks. But I really like this concept of open frameworks because it's like it allows people to like just be like the master of their own fate, right? Like, sure, there are obviously service providers that help you with these frameworks, but fundamentally they enable you to do something you don't need to ask for permission, right? Like the really cool thing about Uniswap was like, hey, I no longer have to like talk to the centralized exchanges to like get my token listed. And we really feel that like with Interrupt, it has to be the same thing. Like you shouldn't have to like beg a BD team to like have them support your chain. You should be able to take open source code and just do it yourself. That's where, again, to hopefully add a little bit of a Hyperlane angle to it. Like this is basically what we've been working on with Hyperlane for the last 3 years, right? Like Hyperlane is fully open source. We have kind of hopefully had good abstractions that allow different parts of the interop stack to basically plug in, right? For example, on the verification side, we have these things called interchain security modules that kind of like allow different systems, for example, like Espresso, to basically provide their value added kind of abilities to consumers of the framework. One notable example of that is what Caldera announced yesterday, of their meta layer, right? And the meta layer is basically using Hyperlane as the message passing for all of these Caldera rollups that they're deploying. And they were able to do that because it was fully open source, right? There was no license, there was no like deal they had to make. Like they just like took the code, like now have it in their infrastructure. And our hope is that, we'll need a lot of interop over the next few months and years to like really unify Ethereum. And I think open source frameworks are like the best way to get there. I think that's it. If you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, my favorite example is Kubernetes. Like Google started Kubernetes because they were like, well, like Docker orchestration is kind of hard, and developers like keep reinventing it themselves. And what they're doing is they end up basically using like AWS like proprietary service and then being vendor locked in that, right? And so Google created Kubernetes as an open framework, right? And like people could host their own Kubernetes cluster and now have container orchestration. But realistically, nobody wants to run your own Kubernetes cluster. And so then you do end up using the services of somebody like Google to host Kubernetes for you, right? And so we think of like Hyperlane very similarly, where like, right, well, teams like Caldera, right, like, who believe like, look, interop is like a key part of our product. Like we will want to actually own that product experience and therefore take on infrastructure burden. But a lot of teams will not want to do that. And that's where we think, obviously, like our off-chain infrastructure services are going to be like helpful for those teams. Yeah, so I think the number one thing what I mentioned, right, is relaying, right? So like if you have, for example, a message passing API that doesn't consider relaying, right? And then you build, let's say, a token wrapping contract on top of that messaging API, right? Like you force the developer of that token contract to consider, oh, like these two different like message passing protocols, right? Like that actually implement that API, message passing API, they actually have different like semantics when it comes to like quoting for like the relayer. Right, and so basically now you move that consideration up to the token contract level, right? And so that makes it just hard to have generic token wrapping contracts, for example, because they always have to like be like, oh, if I want to use like Axelar, they have this gas service, right? Oh, if I want to use like Superchain native interop, right? Like this is going to be this gas service. And so from our perspective, I think that's what I would call a leaky abstraction, I guess, because it makes it hard to build higher level guarantees on top of that. It should be at the message passing level. That's what I would say, right? Like how to make sure that a like user and developer can ensure that their message will get processed on the destination chain is very much, to me at least, like consideration for the message API. Cool. Yeah, great question. I personally think, how do I say this politically correct? I personally think that like as like developers of a framework that gives people options, you do have a responsibility to provide useful guidance as to what options people should pick, and also know that most people do not actually pick any options, right? And so I think it is dangerous to say like, well, the defaults, like the security or like the trade-off that you choose for the default doesn't matter because people could always choose whatever they want. I think it's a very dangerous slippery slope because yeah, a lot of value ends up being secured by default options. And so actually having an opinion of like what are useful defaults for people, right? Which again, it won't cover 100%, but it will cover, I would say, like 60 to 70% of most use cases, I think is important. And being able to actually like offer a useful default is something that we definitely take very seriously. Cool. All right. Thank you, everybody.